for just one moment. We'll get started. Sorry, one sec. There we go.
Through ethical storytelling and not exploit. Welcome to Ethical Storytelling. I really want to focus on what it means to empower through ethical storytelling and not exploit. So before we get started, let me introduce who this person is. So I'm Chandra Harris McCrae, and I consider myself really a creative force. Within creativity, within storytelling, within marketing, and within communications within the philanthropic sector. So right now I have the privilege and the pleasure of serving as the Vice Chancellor of Strategic Marketing and Communications at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Shout out to the Windy City, if any of you are out there. And then I also get the privilege and pleasure of serving as a senior consultant with the inclusion firm, which you see up on your screen. And so that's how I'm coming to you, standing in representation of the inclusion firm, which I will share more about before this presentation is over. So like I said, my work really centers in on storytelling, equity, and strategy, and how we use those things to inform, inspire, engage, and create impact within partnerships and systems. So with that, let's get started. Growing up in a poor Chicago neighborhood, my father would wake before the sun to go to work. He worked as a laborer on the railroad. Every day before he would get to work, he would pick up the Chicago Tribune newspaper. He'd hold onto that paper until he got home at 3 p.m. every day, and then he'd sling it on a rickety small kitchen table and call me to read it to him. From a small child through high school, I read to my father because he couldn't read for himself. He was illiterate. This is just one part of my story, told in a very defined way. My question to you is this ethical storytelling? Let's come back to that. We'll move on to first define ethical storytelling. So when you think of ethical storytelling, how do you define it? I want to define it today as I think it should be defined, as social change communications without exploitation. Again, I'll say that again. Social change communications without exploitation. So this then means that the storyteller is the one who is telling their story. In my case, the story of me reading to my father is my story to tell, that I choose to share with you or someone else, to then write it or share more widely with an audience who hopefully can create an impact for good because of it. So let's dive a bit deeper into the understanding. Now that we know how we're defining ethical storytelling, we'll first spend some time understanding why you are not the storyteller. I like to say you're the story sharer from that point of view. Then we'll talk about what it means to have power with and not over. And then most importantly, the best part, we'll talk about what it means to move beyond good intentions and to actually put into practice what we've learned. So let's begin. It is important to begin with you and shifting how you see your role within the story of someone else. I cannot anchor this enough. You are not the storyteller. Storytelling should not be transactional. Instead, you get the privilege. you get the privilege of listening to someone else's story, their journey, and you get to share it. Setting your posture, your positioning is so critical to the journey of ethical storytelling. Once you've gotten your posture in check, then the honesty must continue to formulate the goals of why you are story sharing. Is it because you want to spark a conversation? And if that's the case, then you must provide the time and space for the conversation to occur. Do you want others to share their stories, or better yet, give to support stories like the one you're sharing? Then you must provide a mechanism and the reason why they should. These first steps of posture and goals are necessary to interrogate and must not be skipped over. You have to start with posture and goals. Then from there, we can explore, how do we create equitable outcomes for all members of our community? We can start by defining people by their aspirations and not their challenges. We do this by harnessing asset framing, our second point. Pioneered by Trayvon Shorters, asset framing sees the hopes and aspirations of humanity, not an at-risk this, a poor that, or a low income this. You see the hope before you see the problem. You see the dream before you see the circumstance. You see the humanity instead of making one into an object that needs to be dealt with and defined by their challenge. Whatever that aspiration is, I aspire to be the president, I aspire to be a scientist, a leader, or maybe I aspire to graduate from high school. Whatever that aspirational goal is, acknowledge that first before you go into one's various challenges. That's asset framing. And you're going to be a truer, more real story sharer if you focus there. And then our third point, narrative before strategy. In nonprofit organizations, or frankly, any organization for that matter, it is often strategy that leads the day, and then the strategy sets the tone for how folks are to act. Well, that's just not how humans work, do they? Narrative frames what we do, how we do it, when we do it, and how we decide to do it. And identity is formed from one's narrative. So framing your nonprofit's narrative, your story, is just as critical as any strategy. What is your nonprofit's, your organization's narrative before you even think about sharing someone else's story? Understanding how others shape your narrative, how others see you, how others perceive your narrative is paramount. Recognizing that people had value and aspirations before you showed up is key to that narrative. So let's wipe away Superman and saving someone, right? Therefore, your organization should not present a negative narrative or a stigmatizing one in order to incite action from stakeholders, or even to gain sympathy from a larger public because you're stigmatizing the very community that you likely intend to serve and likely that your mission is founded upon. Thinking in form of narrative, a wise person once said, there are always three stories: the story you tell, the story you hear, and the story that is true. Well, let's add a fourth. What about the story you are not hearing? Think about the stories you are not hearing is just as critical to ethical use of story. After all, stories are extremely personal, powerful, and persuasive. They can affect great change in organizations in the way a person perceives a situation or other people. So what does that mean? You listen for what's being said, but you also listen to what's not being said. Those nonverbal clues, right? To be a true narrative leader, you must respect and uphold the highest ethical standards when you gather those stories, when you share those stories. And then thinking about the people you're working with, that they choose to tell their story to you. So moving on, it is paramountly important that when you choose to share a story, you do it power with and not power over. What do I mean by this? When you become a story sharer, we've already established that you're not the storyteller. We're going to center in on asset framing and leveraging a narrative, not strategy. In doing that, in doing those things, asset framing, story sharing, leveraging narrative, you are practicing power with and not over. I call this out because you may not remember the points I shared. And so what? But if you can remember this, power with and not over, and can you play that over in your head, then your actions will and should follow. Power with, not over. Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie warns in 2009, in her 2009 TED Talk, about the danger of a single story in power. She says, how stories are told, who tells them, when they are told, and how many stories are told are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell or share the story of another person, but to make it the definite story of the person. So if I'm walking across the street and you see me and you hate me, so you intentionally run me over, that's terrible. On the other hand, if I'm walking across the street and you're not paying attention and you still run me over, it really doesn't matter what your intention was because the outcome is the same. I am not alive. Impact in this case quite literally means more than intent. So let's explore how to move beyond intention with practical questions you can use and practice. Let's start with consent. Do you have the person's consent to tell their story for this purpose in this medium? Before you jump into story gathering mode, take a good look at your informed consent documents. Better yet, it might be wise to have someone outside of your organization look at them. You might want to offer choices about the ways in which an individual can share their story, whether that be through anonymity, whether that be only in certain circumstances or formats, or only to certain audiences. It is not okay to simply have a broad consent form and let a person sign off to share their whole story. They need to know more, who their story is going to be shared with. Secondly, who is at the center? Whose needs and desires are at the center of how the story is being presented? Who is the protagonist of the story? Is it the person or is it your organization? And who is being empowered or who is being disempowered for that matter? Thirdly, what is being reinforced? Are you sharing the story in a way that reinforces harmful stereotypes or stigmas about a social issue or the people who are affected by it? Then you likely aren't practicing asset framing. So call that into question. And lastly, story with accountability. What will happen to the person after you share their story in this way? Could it cause harm? Are you compensating them? Are you going to continue in that relationship? Or is it just a matter of you get what you need and you move on? So let's try this again. My father planted a dream, a seed within me. He fertilized that seed, he nurtured that seed, and he watched it grow because he poured into me what he didn't have by requiring me to read the Chicago Tribune to him daily after school. He could not read, but he didn't have to because I was his vessel to what was going on in the world. And he gave me the greatest gift of seeking out words. Stories is a way of being that I eventually would become a journalist and be able to stand before you today, anchored in story. I became the writer of the words that I once read to him. So knowing what we know now, let's go back to our original question. Is this ethical storytelling? It's the same story. but different from how I first told it. So with that, I would love to engage with you further. If you have a desire or need to learn about inclusive storytelling or any other philanthropic practices, certainly feel free to reach out to the inclusion firm. Angelique Grant is the brainchild and the principal behind the inclusion firm. And I, along with others, get to come alongside her to practice what we preach in regards to inclusive storytelling and philanthropic measures for impact and organizational change. It is truly our jam. So certainly, I would be delighted to support you and be of service to you. Please feel free to reach out to me directly. Thank you so much for spending your time with me, and I look forward to our conversation.
All right, the floor is yours, Chandra.
So thank you, Kyra, and certainly thank you all for the gift of your time. I don't take it lightly that you're spending your time with me, so I'm indebted to each of you for doing so. I am absolutely ready to have this conversation. So wherever we want to begin, if someone wants to unmute and pose a question, or if you would like to put a question in chat, I'm all yours. Did I do that good of a job? I doubt it.
I'll ask a question.
Go ahead, Lauren. Thank
Hi.
you.
Thank you so much, Chandra. That was fantastic. I'm a journalist and I run editorial at Media Impact Funders. And I've always strived to have very human focused storytelling in all of my work and centering the people whom I have the privilege of reporting on in my work. And I know sometimes colleagues have deliberated among each other, like, okay, how do we, really include the person that we're doing a story on or a story with in the storytelling process and still maintain the integrity of the story, right? There's a lot of, whenever you hear like, okay, well, let's share the story with the person who's in our story, you get a lot of pushback, like, oh no, that's not ethical. Can you speak to that a little bit and how you've sort of shown journalists the light in that capacity and where maybe sometimes boundaries need to still exist?
Absolutely, Lauren. So, my pre-world was in journalism, and this is how I'm even sitting before you today, before I even entered into higher ed. So I'm going to pull from that world to the world where I am now to answer your question, Lauren. I think the integrity of journalism really centers on building that trust and relationship with the person, right? I think when you're telling, and I like to say sharing someone else's story, I think you need to be upfront and clear on what the story is and what it could possibly become based on them sharing their story. So instead of just starting off on an interview, hitting the tape recorder or taking notes, why not have a conversation of clarity, right? Like, what are you hoping to get out of this? Here's what I'm hoping to get out of this. And then have that dialogue back and forth so that when you start the interviewing process, both parties actually know where they stand versus waiting until the very end or waiting until after the story is written. I think secondly, I have always been a fan of recording my interviews and actually sharing the recording with the person that is gifting me with the opportunity to hear their story. So therefore, there's not confusion on about who said what, when, how, and when the story comes out, they have a lot more comfortability knowing that they've heard or seen something, right? Even if you're not necessarily giving them, here's the final draft of the actual story. It allows, again, that trust to be built, that when Lauren and team actually interview me, they're going to take what I say and not necessarily misconstrue or change it once I'm able to read that story. I think thirdly, always give folks an opportunity to come back, right? Keep the door open. I don't know if many of you all are like me, but if I have the opportunity to sleep on it, I might feel differently in the morning, right? And if you allow me to reach back out to you to say, I wasn't really wanting to share this, but I really wanted to lift this up more, then again, you're building another thread of trust with that individual to say, okay, this is a flexible two-way relationship. And then I would say, lastly, once the story is out, be the first to share it. Don't let, and I know this is difficult to do because media is so intensively transformative in regards to how we get it. It's so immediate. But if there's any way that once it's posted or published, that you can share it with the person with the note, that's another seed of trust, that they didn't have to go out and find it or hear about it from their mother or their friend that I heard or I saw this article written about you. And so, Lauren, those are 4 avenues that I have used personally, particularly in my journalism career. In higher ed, it's a little bit different. We do tend to share the story before it's published because we're often building a journey of a relationship with those individuals. So depending on where you're sitting at, that may be an opportunity as well. But from the journalistic integrity piece, I absolutely understand what you're saying about not sharing the final piece, because I lived that for more than a decade. And so what I've offered are just those seeds of trust, that once you build that with the individual, then it makes the road so much smoother.
Thank you, Chandra. That was excellent.
Thank you, Lauren.
We did have a question come through in the chat that asked if you have any examples in the news sector of who is doing this all well.
So I would say, and depending on how you define news sector, not necessarily a newspaper per se, but some things that come to mind are Humans of New York. If you follow that on Instagram, it is just truth telling. It's the person's story straight from their mouths. It's not filtered, it's not changed, etc. I think that I follow that consistently, and it's just like one of those human to human moments, right? Like, this is just a real live story. I'm not calling you to do anything necessarily, although they've used that platform in that way. So I think that's a really good example. There are a ton of nonprofits that are doing the work well. If you think about nonprofits focused on water conservation, nonprofits focused on education and hunger, in South Africa, any continent really, including the US, homeless population, nonprofits, a lot of those organizations, particularly in large cities, New York, California, are really doing the work well of telling the story, not from a victimization standpoint, but more so through the human lens standpoint. I also encourage you, if you heard in my presentation, Trayvon Shorters is someone that I follow. He has an equity lens of how we frame and storytell. He talks extensively about asset framing, and his work is just tremendous. If you're looking for someone to really engage with and follow. Those are the ones that are coming to mind. I certainly can add others to the Google Doc that has been shared later on today, because I'm certain there are a ton of others, and you all probably have other examples as well. Other questions? Kyra, did I miss anything else? Let's see.
Yeah, we did have one note from Deborah in the chat, just expressing gratitude for introducing the Tribune Shorter's asset framing approach, and how that sort of plays into her work. Deborah, feel free, no pressure at all, but feel free to jump in on this conversation as well.
If you do Deborah Douglas and asset framing, you'll see it. I mention it every time I can because it is the antidote to the thing that ails our storytelling or story sharing. Thank you for that language too, Chandra. I met Trabian a few years ago, and we actually watched his presentation at Solutions Journalism Network. Shout out to Amy, he's on here. And we got to do a breakout session and actually, you know, come up with like very specific sorts of storytelling tropes about underrepresented communities, and like go, okay, what's the deficit frame? Then what's the asset frame? And just to flip it. And when we move into our newsroom, we're still working from home, I want to like have like a wall. Because sometimes it can get kind of tricky. You get stuck in that trope, you get stuck in that typical way, you know, that we talk about things, and it takes like, it's like building new muscles to think about what the asset frame is. And for some people it can be tricky because they feel like it's cheerleading, but it's not. It's just regarding communities in the fullness of their humanity. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Deborah. I totally agree. You saw my head like about to fall off in terms of nodding. I love the idea of doing a wall in the newsroom so folks can remember. Like you said, it is a muscle that has to be practiced. And I often say, when you think about your own story, use it. Right? Because I think as humans, we're often so critical of our own selves in your day-to-day life. When you think about your own narrative, if you mess up, you immediately go to something negative and you reprimand yourself more than likely. But what if you said, well, no, what if we looked at it from this way? And that actually was the best approach in this circumstance. So removing that woulda, coulda, shoulda, instead use asset framing for your own life. And then if you use it in your own life, along with repeating what I mentioned, power with and not over, then you have what Deborah said, I love, the antidote to be able to tell a story in a more truer and richer way. And I also think it's not a cop-out, because every community and every neighborhood and every life, their story is their story, whatever that looks like. If it's not the same as mine, doesn't make it any less, right? And so if we're able to really infuse that and really listen for the asset framing, the story becomes a lot richer. You know, and lastly, I'll just say this, and I didn't say this in my presentation. You know, I personally do not appreciate and really encourage folks, you're not the savior. Just as the same way that you're not the storyteller, you're not the savior. You're not swooping in to save someone, because their story is still theirs and they don't need saving. You know, so think about those when you are storytelling, and also think about your own story and how you would like it to be told. I'm so glad that you all have heard of Mr. Shorters. He's amazing. It sounds like all of you all have either met or worked with and used his work in your own journey. So that's wonderful. But that's not a new name that you all are hearing for the first time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just say, I think what you just said is so powerful. And it sort of makes me think to, I think, thinking about of, like, you know, how can we do this work within ourselves and how that radiates, you know, into our professional lives. Something that I think about all the time is people just want to be like seen and heard. They don't really need someone to save them. They just need someone to listen to them. And so I'm not a storyteller. I work with development at the Lenfest Institute. But I can imagine how important thinking about this through that lens before you approach someone to interview them, before you try and tell their story, to really like do that inner work before you go out in the world and try to tell other stories. That really resonated with me. And I think that's really powerful, and something that I think whether you're a journalist or whether you work in fundraising specifically, or whatever your background is, something so useful to carry throughout your professional and your personal life, really. So that really resonated with me.
Thank you for sharing that, Kyra. I couldn't agree more.
Looks like we have another question in the chat. I can read it out from Claudia. She's asking, Chandra, do you have an example from your own experience in working as a journalist of when someone changed your perspective of the story you thought you were telling versus the story they believed you were telling?
I absolutely do, Claudia. I probably have many, but I'm going to share the one that comes to mind. As I was rounding out my journalism career, I went to my editors and said, I really want to do something that speaks to the legacy of my journalism career and what really matters to me. And so I would like to tell someone's story that is dealing with death, whether that be personally or within their family, just some, and if I'm being really honest, some traumatic story about death, because it's a journey that we all are guaranteed to have, right? So it's a story that's common to all of us. And so Claudia, if you can hear me speaking, I thought about it all wrong to begin with, right? Because it was about me. It was centered in me, and really not thinking of the humanity of the story. And so the editor said, that sounds like something that will be terribly difficult for you to accomplish, but go ahead. And so he sent me out there, unfeathered, wings flying. And the first thing I did was reached out to hospice units at various hospitals and chapels and churches. And the first priest that I came to, when I shared, he said, you need to re-examine why you want to do this. And then once you do that, call me back. And it took me a second to really understand, because he didn't go into detail of you did this wrong or not. And so I did that, and I called him back, and he was able to connect me with a fairly young woman who had a lung disease, who was in the last stage of her life. And I went in with this great, just profound respect for her saying yes. And so I started that conversation with clarity, right? The very thing that I offered earlier in this conversation was really sitting with her to say, I really want you to share your story in terms of how you want to share it. And so, Claudia, if I had not been jolted out of that, I may have gone in with this sorrowful mindset, or this, oh, poor you mindset. But instead, I went in to say, I want to, as Kyra said, I want to see you, I want to hear you, and I want to share the story that an obituary will never do justice for your life. And through tears, we were able to agree in the story that we were going to share. And so that led me on almost a 3-month journey of sitting with her almost daily, watching Oprah, doing crafts, taking naps, really become really ingrained in her day-to-day. And really gaining her trust to tell her story. And guess what? She would never see it, because the clarity conversation was that the story would be shared after her death. And so, to make a long story short, that was one of the most resilient moments that I carry with me when I think about storytelling and sharing a person's story and telling it from their perspective, not with my bias and not with my sorrowful, oh, woe is you moment. And when that story was shared, her whole family gained trust and belief in journalism. I'm not going to just say me, but in journalism overall, that they asked me to do her eulogy at her funeral. So to me, that was the greatest gift, that I actually used asset framing and used humanity of being just human to tell a story that really made an impact, not only for her family, but for all who read it. Claudia, I hope that speaks to your question and offers an example. Perfect. Thank you for affirming, Claudia. Other questions or challenges, or even specific examples? If someone wants to talk through something that maybe you're dealing with right now, that we can sound out and solve together, I'm open to that as well.
Chandra, I do have a question. As you think about the transition from storytelling to story sharing as a journalist, that's obviously kind of lives inside that relationship with the person whose story you're working to tell. Do you also think about how the story is shared differently? Like, do you think about the presentation and how and who you're sharing it with, and for lack of a better word, sort of like your audience when you take on that framing?
Absolutely. I think it is paramount to think about how and when that story will be shared, and to enter into that with the clarity conversation as well, right? I always say that not everything that everyone tells you is meant to be told, right? I think oftentimes as journalists, I know when I was trained, it was write down everything and capture every moment and then retell it and like fit everything in. And I really struggled with that at the early stages of my career. And then I started to learn that no, not everything is meant to be shared. When you go to, I hate to say it, a boring city council meeting, you don't share everything that they're talking about, because snooze fest, right? Like you wait for the high moments and you share, okay, they're cutting taxes, or they're implementing a tax on the school system, the things that really matter. And so when you look at something like that from an entity and you transition that to humanity, it's the same thing in a different way, right? I want to be clear that when you're listening to someone, I'm not just listening for the high points, but I'm listening to what matters to the audience and to this person telling their story, right? So Meg, thinking about your question, if you're in a fundraising organization and you have a donor pool, donors want to hear about success. They want to hear about, when I give you this $1 million, what impact is that going to make? Not, this person doesn't have a bed to sleep in, right? Like, what difference can I make? So thinking about that donor audience and really centering it on why a person should and will give, and tell that story from an impactful asset framing place to say, this is how you're contributing and this is what this means. Thinking about another audience of, say it's a broader audience for a newspaper, you have the opportunity as a journalist to give social conscience, right? And so levering in on that asset framing and telling a story about, quote unquote, the worst neighborhood in me. Well, let's not start that way. Let's tell them that they don't know that's actually enormously positive. about a certain neighborhood, about who lives there, and create that humanity piece. I think one of the things that is so divisive, I believe, in our cultural times today is making human beings into its, right? Like losing that they feel like I feel. They have a family like I have a family, whether that's the one you were born into or the one that you choose to be adopted by, right? Like, let's expand all of those definitions and transform people into people. And then I think, it sounds so cliche and so simple, but I think it's really easy to project, well, I would never do that. I would say stop when you say that and think for a second that if you were in that exact same situation and you didn't have a 2020 hindsight vision to look back on, I don't know what I would do, right? So let's offer more truth beneath what the thing actually is to really interrogate that in our own systems. And so to come back to your question, Meg, because you got me off on a sidebar soapbox there, it certainly matters who you're speaking to. And I think when you're story sharing and you have the gift of hearing someone's story, that person needs to understand who is their story going to be shared with so that they can then make a choice about how they share their story and whether they want their story to be shared that way. And then the last thing I'll share on that is allow the person who's telling their story to decide. These 3 parts is what I want to share. I know I talked to you about 12 things, but here are the 3 things that really matter to me and will be really fulfilling if you shared these 3 things. Again, to just build that trust with that individual and for them to know that you're a human being and you actually care about their story, and to go back to what Kyra said, that you actually see them.
Thank you. I wonder if I might follow up to that too.
Yes,
It's really helpful. I'm wondering too how you think about, like, as you're having those conversations with people and kind of setting their expectations for the entire experience. How much are you, I don't know, warning them? If this is a news story, for instance, it's going to go online. It's probably going to be there for a long time. Like if it's a radio story, it might show up in these places, or like we have a partnership with all these other organizations. Like how do you talk to people about the potential impacts of even the fact that they're talking to you and agreeing to being part of this story?
So
like, where do you see your role in that?
absolutely. So Meg, I see it the same way as asset framing, right? So instead of projecting fear or anxiety or saying, this is going to be in a million places with an eyebrow raise, instead I say, do you realize that your impact is going to reach X number of people? And by you sharing your story, you have the ability to change a life. Right? Like, so really reframing how you share, how it's going to be shared, and then let them ask, well, wait a minute, you said 20 million. Who are all those people, right? So I'm not saying stay away from begging the question and being transparent, but it's all about how you present it, right? Whether they will say yes or no. I think the other point that we haven't talked about, Meg, is I have had people where I've interviewed them and at the end, they're like, you know what? I don't really want to do this. And as heartbreaking as that is, particularly if you're on a deadline or if you don't have a backup plan, I get it, right? So it's like not becoming infuriated with that person or upset, but saying, you know what, I absolutely understand where you are. Will you do me the favor of at least thinking about it for 24 hours? And then I'll come back and revisit this with you. And if your answer is still no, I will respect that. Because I think you win more with honey than not, right? And I can think about some folks who have said no to me in the past, and then something else comes along and they're the first to reach out because they felt respected through the process. You all know it's 6 degrees of separation. Our worlds are interlocked in this ecosystem. So it's really important how you treat people, because you just never know where that's going to come back, even if you think it's worlds apart. Meg, I got on a tirade again. Hopefully I answered the question. Perfect. Is there anything else? I appreciate you all really filling up the chat with just the confirmation and affirmation. I feel like there's a lot of head nods that I can't see and a lot of alignment with this conversation. So I'm so indebted to each of you that we're partnering this work together. And I wrote down every single name. So if you see a LinkedIn request, don't act like you don't know me, because I want to follow you all's work for sure.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for being here. This has been such a wonderful, a really powerful, important conversation. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, Chandra, for all your wisdom. It's so valuable. And I hope to catch you all in one of our next sessions. They begin at 2 p.m. There are a couple to choose from, so check them out, and we hope to see you there. So take care, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you, Kyra.
Thank you.